Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Tea 101. So, this is a tea talk that if you're a tea lover who's just starting out or someone who is really passionate about tea, this is a great place to start, specifically for us because I feel like it's at the root of Kevin, our tea sommelier and owner's knowledge and understanding of tea. And I think this is a great base to understand any and all teas.
Yeah. I don't know where you're at, where your tea knowledge is. We're going to cover today different tea types and understanding those a little bit, along with looking at history and some culture and traditions, and hopefully make it really interesting. I hope so. I find it really fascinating.
We love tea over here, if you couldn't tell already. So
We definitely do. So a lot of what we do as a business is tea blending. So we are adding real fruits, flowers, herbs, and spices to tea to really complement and elevate and have you experience tea in a new and surprising way, while also really honoring tea tradition and cultures throughout the world as well, and how they have had flavors interact with tea. But when it comes down to it, we really love the tea. So most of these things we're using as the base tea for a lot of our different blends that we have in our business. Yeah, we've got quite a bit. So let's jump in.
yeah,
Let's take
I'm
a look
ready.
at it. So I don't know if you have heard before of things like white tea or green tea or black tea. Those are typically the most common ones that we
Yeah.
talk about or hear about. Usually it's black and green.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the more common. They all come from the exact same plant. It's called Camellia sinensis for those that want to get a little bit, go to school here. But it's the same exact bush that you pick those leaves, and then from there, how you process it comes different forms of tea.
Interesting.
And
I
so,
didn't even know that. Learning
yeah,
new things.
yeah. Actually, for a long time, even the British were convinced that they were two different plants that made black tea versus green tea, and they almost discredited the Scottish botanist that they sent undercover for corporate espionage into China to steal their trade secrets. They actually almost completely discredited him and left him on his own to fend for himself because he said, "I'm telling you guys, it's the same plant. They're just processing the leaf differently."
That's crazy. I actually had no idea. I learn something new every day on this job, and that is why I love doing these talks with Kevin, because I feel like the knowledge that I learn, everybody should be learning. And Kevin's knowledge and base of this company, like we just mentioned, is at the root of the origins and histories and the nerdier stuff of tea. But genuinely, it is in every single aspect and corner of the earth, lies tea in history.
So one of the main differences that you find in the way that tea is processed is whether or not a tea is oxidized. So
Okay.
oxidation is like what happens when you slice an apple and air hits it, it starts to brown a little bit.
Okay.
And so when air interacts with some of the moisture, there has to be some warmth and temperature involved as well. Oxidation starts happening. And so you get that in different forms with each types of the tea that's processed. So the green teas that you have, those ones would be not oxidized at all. So they want it to be as green as possible.
Okay.
And so they use a couple different types of ways to
Preserve.
keep the tea from oxidizing. And one of them, if you're in Japan, would be to steam the leaves, kind of like you would do like steam spinach or broccoli,
Okay.
steam vegetables.
Yeah.
And it keeps a lot brighter, fresher tastes, more vegetal, a little bit more grassy, and gives a much darker green color. And we actually have a Japanese green tea
Okay.
here.
Is that our
we have.
sencha?
This is our sencha. And good job. Good job. There you go. And then you would have, in China, the style for green tea is often pan roasted, like in a big wok style pan that they're roasting and firing it, which would be kind of like roasting vegetables. So it gives a little bit
Okay.
more. It still is very vegetal. You get that green, fresh flavor. And you can get some grassiness, but not as much as you're going to get from a Japanese tea. And you're going to have a lot more nuttiness that you
Okay.
get from that roasting
So
process.
from my understanding, in order to stop the oxidation, they're either cooking or steaming it to stop it from oxidizing. Whereas with a black tea, you would maybe let it sit for a little bit longer so it does get a different flavor profile.
Not just sit, but you also want to agitate the leaves some to where it
Okay.
releases some of its juices. And then a lot of times they'll introduce they need to create the right conditions for that right oxidation to happen. And so
Interesting.
sometimes they'll put it in rollers or they'll roll it by hand, which is where you get some of this oolong tea right here. I don't know if you've heard of oolong. Not everybody has, but if you start to get a little bit more of a tea enthusiast,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably going to discover this pretty soon. But you can kind of see here that this tea, it's going to be rolled into little
Okay.
balls.
So it's like they took it in their fingers and rolled it like that. Is that
So
how tea is rolled? It's hand rolled by like
sometimes it can be
okay.
done with machines. Most all oolong is done by hand. This is
Wow.
somebody who's rolling each of these things.
That's incredible to think
And
about.
yeah, so the oxidation with this with oolong tea can run anywhere from about 10 to about 80 to 90%. So it's
Okay.
everything in between green and black tea,
Got
because
it.
black tea is going to be 100% oxidized, which gives you that really dark tea. In China, it's called red
Okay.
tea, but you get a lot more like darker leaves that is
And when you
fully
brew it,
oxidized.
it does have a red tint to it, so that
Mhm.
makes sense why it would be called that.
And so you have like if we go back to the oolong, you have different stages depending on the farm, depending on the tea master, depending on that harvest and what they think they can bring out in it. A lot
Yeah.
of times the lighter oxidized, like it's more like this, are going to be a little bit more like green tea
Because this one, I
quality.
was going to say, looks a little bit more green. If I were to look at this and if I didn't know anything about tea, I would assume it was a green tea.
Mm-hmm.
But when people think of oolong, actually, when people come into, when we're selling our teas at craft fairs, people will consider oolong a black tea, which I think is interesting most of the time.
So they can get pretty dark and get a
Yes.
lot closer to a black tea. Usually they call them red oolongs
Okay.
or longer oxidized oolongs.
Okay.
And they get a lot darker, a lot nuttier. You get a little bit more fruit quality to it. Really do love and kind of a smokiness that you get from it as well. Whereas the green ones are going to be a lot more floral, sometimes even creamier. There's some places in the world that are known for like they call them milk oolongs because they
Okay.
actually taste like you added milk, but it's just from the leaf itself.
Interesting.
When these leaves open up, it's usually a larger leaf in the oolong. You open up, you can see the amount of oxidation on the leaf. And this one, it's going to be just around the edges, whereas like a darker oolong is going to be most of the leaf that you're going to see that oxidation. And that
Okay.
happens from a lot of hand processing where they are drying and like rolling it and tossing it by hand and getting it to in a longer drying process, and that tossing that happens, the rolling is what happens towards the end of the last drying process, so that
Okay.
doesn't necessarily oxidize it that way. They're tossing it in baskets and
Okay.
getting that oxidation to occur. So we don't blend a lot of oolong because it's one that is so complex in the flavor, and because of the handcrafted quality of it that's even beyond all of these other teas that do have a level of, because we're getting from a lot of small farms, there is a lot of a craft quality there, but they do also use machines in the process for some of these that
Yeah.
have been more common over time.
Now, can I ask, and we can cut this out if this is not accurate, gunpowder tea, is that gum tea or
Gunpowder.
is it
Mm-hmm.
gunpowder?
Mm-hmm.
Is that similar to oolong with the hand rolling? Because isn't that hand rolled tea as well?
It is rolled. Sometimes it can be done by hand. Most of the time, it's going to be done by machines these days.
Okay.
So it is a rolled green tea,
So
and
what makes an oolong, I guess, and a gunpowder tea? Because a lot of, well, not a lot of people, but if you're into tea, gunpowder tea is something that you will eventually, stumble
mm-hmm.
across. I know quite a few people who are passionate about tea, and they'll come up and ask us about it. And so, what really separates an oolong tea from like a gunpowder tea? Is it just that it's a green and then maybe a slightly less green tea, or?
Yeah, so the gunpowder is going to be fully green, so not oxidized at all.
Oh,
So if
okay.
it did oxidize some, it would be a version of oolong. And so they are both rolled though, into like little pellets. There's a bit more of a uneven quality in this oolong, where the gunpowder is going to be a lot more
Tightly rolled.
tightly rolled and a little bit more even, because most of the time, like I said, it's done these rolling machines that mimic what they would do by hand. Gunpowder, the reason why it's become more popular and more known is because it was one of the first green teas when tea took a long time to travel by sea or by land. It's one of the teas that was hardy enough, that was strong enough to be able to make it to different parts of the
Oh,
globe.
wow.
So most green teas are going to be way too delicate, and if they're on a ship for a long time with the sea
Mm-hmm.
air and with changes in temperature,
I
it's
don't even know. I
likely
want to know what it does to the tea.
it's likely not going to be very fresh by the time it shows up, but it can start to oxidize. It can
Mm-hmm.
ruin the tea.
Well, and what's interesting too is, here in the United States, tea is not regulated by the FDA. It's something that never has been. Tea and coffee, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, that's why when you're looking for different kinds of tea, when people get into tea and they know what they like and it's a very specific kind, they will like go to extreme lengths to
Mm-hmm.
find great quality tea, because who knows what's happening on those ships when they're coming over here with those
Yeah.
lower quality teas, simply because we don't regulate it. And so we are getting the scraps from a lot of other countries a lot of the
Yeah,
times.
yeah. A lot of the best. I mean, we have a consumer tradition, but not
Yes.
really a craft
There's
appreciation
not
of
a
the
culture
craft
around it.
tradition, especially when it comes to tea.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times, like the reason why black tea traveled a little bit better, so that's why it became more popular in Europe, became more popular in places further out from Asia where mostly tea is grown. Yeah, what you're talking about with the quality often is hard to find because quality controls and even grading of tea is done in-house. So it's done by the producer themselves. They say this is this quality of tea. And usually how the markets are designed in the world, if it's not that good, it's not going to sell. But because we have changed a little bit of how the type access that we have to products around the globe, it is kind of hard to get good tea here and trust that it's going to be good
Mhm.
because it hasn't gone through some of the natural selection
Yeah.
process in their markets that are going to make it to where if they say it's a good tea but it doesn't taste good and people don't like it, then it doesn't go to auction. It doesn't work that way. But now that we're buying directly from the farms, like you really have to go with somebody that you trust that
Yeah.
is working well with these people that can make sure that they're going to bring a great product and not
Yeah.
just tell you that it's something good and you get it and find out it's not very good, or maybe you don't know because you've never
Yeah.
had better.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that is definitely something that's happening a lot with matcha. One of the
Mhm.
things that we have done, we talked about this in another talk, where we have adopted the term ceremonial as some sort of quality measure.
Yeah.
It means absolutely nothing to anyone in Japan.
And that's so funny to me because a lot of the times the biggest question I think I get is your matcha ceremonial grade?
Oh
And I
yeah, all
say,
the time.
yes. However, that's a grading system that we've created, and that scale is really hard to really even trust because you could have some of the highest first pick leaves matcha, like the best matcha you can get, and it could have been sitting for a year by the time you get it, and then it's not good. So it's
Yeah.
like, it really is a tricky thing, and I think that goes the same with any other tea as well. Finding those high quality, good tasting teas are really hard to come across, especially when they're handcrafted like we do.
Well, we have two other tea styles to talk about that are a little bit more rare. One of them you very likely have heard of, and one of them you might not have ever heard of. That definitely is something that a tea nerd would know. But the first one we would talk about is white tea. So this one, if you can see, you can actually really see the leaves in this, where the rest
Yeah.
of them, not until you brew it can you tell that it's actually a leaf in some of these.
Mm-hmm.
But this one you can see the leaves, and it also has these little buds here, and I'm going to give you one of these.
I absolutely love white tea.
So, so yeah, the leaf and the bud is what this is. Sometimes you can have white tea that's just the bud tea. So this is usually earlier harvest or the first time when buds are springing out and developing on the plant. So it's going to be a little bit softer, a little bit sweeter. It has this like really soft downy hair that actually protects it from insects, from frost, as it's growing in some of the cooler springtime and like as it just starts to release those buds.
So this is not the same plant as green and black tea, or it is?
Exactly the same. So this is the least processed.
Okay.
So this is pretty much just like likely what they did for the very first tea that they ever consumed is just picked from the plant and dried in the air.
So can I ask, then what makes because white tea is my favorite, and if you haven't tried white tea and you like peach tea, we have a great white peach tea. I used
just
to
won award.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, it did. So we have tried to kind of embrace white tea as something that can I feel like it's a great base to infuse lots of fruity and floral things with because it's just such a nice base flavor. It's very light. It's very easy to drink. It's not as harsh and hard-hitting on your taste buds as a black tea. But what makes a white tea less caffeinated than a green tea? Because we've talked this whole tea talk about how it comes from the same plant, and I'm sure everyone else is wondering, how the heck do you have different caffeine levels in these?
So caffeine can change because it's a plant. So the amount of caffeine that you get can change even from the same type of tea that's harvested at in different years. Sometimes can have more caffeine than other times.
Wow.
A lot of times we think that black tea has the most amount of caffeine.
Which is actually not true.
That's actually not true. And a lot of times green tea can have more, and even sometimes white tea, because the caffeine is released into the leaves earlier.
Got it.
And so if it's younger leaves that you're harvesting, then they're going to have more caffeine in them than older leaves. But if you get
Interesting.
larger leaves, it's going to have a little bit more
So it
caffeine
just
than a
kind of
smaller leaf.
varies.
White tea typically has smaller leaves. It also, have you picked, depending on when you pick it, has it had enough time for all that caffeine to really develop in the plant? So, and because it's lower processed, it's the least processed, to where you don't do a lot, you don't do much at all
Just
except for
pick it
just
off and
drying the
dry it.
leaves.
Yep.
Sometimes that can cause caffeine to develop a little bit more, or condense or concentrate a little bit more
Okay.
into the leaf with the processing itself.
Yeah.
I found, just from personal experiment, I don't know if that's not very scientific, but just from my own
Yeah.
personal consumption, that I have found, outside of matcha, which is a higher concentration of everything that's in tea, it's just going to be a stronger
Yeah.
concentrated amount. So it's going to have more caffeine in matcha than any other tea,
Yeah.
just by volume. But I found that actually the oolongs are the ones where I notice the caffeine more than anything
Okay.
else.
Which makes sense to me, at least, because if you're a matcha lover, then you know like just how hard that caffeine can hit. Coming from someone who I used to be a barista and I used to drink a lot of energy drinks. If you know where I worked, you know if you drink a lot of energy drinks, and it was affecting my body. I was crashing a lot. I was not feeling good, and so when I switched to matcha, I do have like that initial like hit of energy, but I never feel like gross after, It's a great like middle ground. So it makes sense with the oolong for it to kind of be a good in between of that black tea, where you still get the black tea taste. Because I know a lot of people love black tea simply because of the taste, but you're also getting a good amount of caffeine, and it has some similar qualities to green tea is what it's sounding like as well.
One of the reasons why I said the white tea is rare is because it's the smallest harvest always that's going to happen. So they're going to have the least amount that's harvested. It's very specific, usually just in the spring. The least amount of white tea is always going to be available, as opposed to if a farm is going to be producing green tea versus black tea versus oolong, they're going to have a lot more to work with. And so it's rare because it's hard to find and there's a smaller quantity. Black tea has been the favorite for a long time, and mostly because of iced tea. That's typically what you're going to have, is a bold, brisk black iced tea. Not always going to come from Asia like most of the tea does. So tea started in Asia, grown there naturally, right around like southwestern China, and then also northeastern India, around Burma. There still is wild tea grown in that area,
so cool.
Not just cultivated tea. And so those are some of the places that tea grows naturally. And then from there, it's kind of expanded and grown to where you get more of India, you get more of Asia, you get it into Japan. So our last rare tea that we want to talk about is our pu'er tea.
Okay.
A very weird name. And it's also called more commonly a dark tea, because similar to wine, region really matters about these teas and where they're coming from. And especially teas that come from China, they are known for the region that they are in. And so Pu'er was named the region in the Yunnan province, which is known as the birthplace of tea. There's a little bit of debate about that in the tea world, but that's known as the birthplace of tea in China. Some of the oldest tea trees that are still producing are there today. And a lot of times this style of tea is harvested from older trees.
Okay.
And it has to come from the Pu'er region for it to be called Pu'er tea, just like champagne has to come from Champagne. Otherwise, it's just a sparkling wine.
Yep.
So it's similar there. So the rest of the world, if they produce anything like Pu'er, they have to call it a dark tea. But it is a fermented tea. So I said all the other ones deal with oxidation. This can be oxidized or not. Sometimes it's white teas that are done. It's a fermentation process that they have a couple different styles in the way that they do it, sometimes more naturally, that's put in caves. What's really cool about this that I think makes it really interesting is, as we're looking at this whole thing here, you're seeing the history of tea right before you, and all of it is available today, what has been available since ancient times, even though some of it are modern iterations. So to represent the oldest form of tea and also the most modern innovation is actually pu'er.
Wow.
So it goes back to some of the most original form. Although I would say that I believe that the white tea is probably more originally, if you listen to some of the legends, it sounds like just air-dried tea leaves that have come off the tea tree.
Seems like a more natural process of how tea came to be.
When it became cultivated and harvested, then they were pressing it into cakes. And so you actually can see this right here. This is a piece of what was a large disc. This is what I have left of mine. But
It's
it's
very
yeah, it gives you a
interesting.
lot of different colors you get in here as well.
Yeah.
This is a white tea type
So,
style
for
pour.
people who don't really understand like fermentation process, can you kind of explain what that does look like? You kind of mentioned naturally in caves it can
Mm-hmm.
happen, but what is fermentation? What differs that from any of these teas that you've showed us?
Yeah, so this is similar to the oxidation where it's going to involve air, it's going to involve heat, and it's going to involve moisture, I would say, moisture
Mhm.
and time. So having these things age with the right amount of moisture in caves over time, that is one of the ways that they do it. And then sometimes they create a similar situation that causes it to ferment a little bit faster.
Interesting.
It's not fermented in the way that it would be like
Kombucha
turn into
or
kombucha.
yeah.
Um,
It's still a leaf that they're drying out essentially, but they're doing it in a
mhm.
different way. So is it drying into a cake like this? Is that how they
So they would press it and dry it as the final step. We do have another example. This is like chocolate bar style pressed pour cake. Usually you find it in like little pucks or like round cakes. You can find all kinds of different quality and all kinds of different values of this. Some people can have this as their family's inheritance.
Oh
Could be
wow.
a pour tea cake. It's worth that much. And you
That's
can find all
crazy.
kinds of different varieties. It is one of the funkiest with the flavor, but it's going to be the most unique out of all of these. It's going to be the darkest color brew. So we are brewing all of the different teas right now. And one of the things when you do get into different types of tea, what you'll find is that the way you brew it really does matter. And specifically, if the temperature of water is off, or the amount of time that you steep it, or the volume of tea versus water, like those things all really matter, especially when you get into more of the pure form of teas. You want to make sure that you get that dialed in. And so when you are brewing up different things, especially all the matcha lovers out there, when you're doing that, I don't know if you found matcha to be fairly bitter when you make it yourself. One of the reasons could be because it's low quality matcha. It's not good quality. Matcha shouldn't naturally be very bitter. It can be strong tasting, but not bitter. It shouldn't have a bitter taste. And some of the reasons why it could be bitter is either that it's low quality or that you are using too hot of water and you're scorching the leaves. And so whenever you're pouring water into it, you want to make sure that it's lower than a boil, hot water, not boiling water. And then I also tell people, like when you're pouring the water, don't pour it directly over the matcha powder. Pour it kind of down the side of your matcha bowl or your cup to where it comes and lifts and cools a little bit down the side of the glass. So you're not pouring it directly over. And you might notice a bit of a difference in the flavor of the way that it tastes when you're making that. So these other ones are ready here. This first one is our white tea. We have our green tea, our sencha from Japan. And then this one is our oolong. This one comes from China. Some of my favorite actually comes from Taiwan. Really enjoy a lot of their oolongs from there. This is my favorite black tea from China. We have a lot of black teas that come from a lot of different areas as well, especially India. Really, India and Sri Lanka make great black teas. And the last one is our dark tea or our pu'er, the fermented one.
So
Have right here.
interesting.
Yeah, this is more of it's a professional like cupping set that you would find tea buyers use a lot in order to taste the quality of the tea. Like we said, you don't really know the quality of the tea just based off of what the grading has been done at a producer or factory or tea farm until you taste it. And so you'll get these tea leaves in order to taste. That's usually how we go about selecting a lot of the teas that we bring in. It also is a way for us to kind of discover the flavor profile of the tea and figure out what ingredients are we blending, or perhaps if it's a blend that we already have and we're using, we make adjustments to those blends every time we get new ingredients.
Yeah.
We'll taste everything that we get in and we'll go, oh, this needs to be a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that. And we'll dial in kind of like focusing a lens in order to make sure that we're bringing the best out of that tea with those ingredients that we have in that moment.
Yeah. It's like a rainbow of tea.
These first three, they're going to be quite a bit lighter. This one's going to have a little bit more of a browning almost, like a yellowish color in here with a slight green hue. Whereas you're going to get a little bit more green off of the sencha green tea, especially because Japan is known for having a lot greener there.
Yeah.
And then the oolong looks very similar to the green tea, but also a little bit like a white tea as well.
Yeah.
So what you can tell usually the difference with this between a white tea is you're going to get a lot more floral note off of this one here.
Oh yeah, you can really smell the floral in that.
Whereas this one's going to smell a little bit more like sweet hay and peaches.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's so interesting that they come from the same plant, yet they have such different taste and flavor and smell profiles. Like it's just insane
yeah,
how that's how tea came to be from one simple plant.
yeah. When you get into our black teas or our darker teas over here, you've got the black tea that you mentioned already. Looks a little bit more red than black,
Yeah,
whereas you've got our pour that we brewed up here actually looks like a cup of coffee.
it does. It
It's
looks
super
very
dark.
strong.
So this one of the reasons why I really do love this black tea is you get a lot of stone fruit on this, but it has kind of a roasted, a little bit of
Oh yeah.
smokiness that you get from it
Mhm.
too. But it's a really fruity, very fragrant black tea
Mhm.
that we really do enjoy blending with. And one of our award-winning blends, our Port of SF,
Oh
we
yeah.
use this tea in that one, and this has been one of my favorite teas for a long time. This one I mentioned before, but it's a bit different. It's a bit you get like almost like a mushroom, like damp forest floor type
Oh yeah.
quality. You
Very different smell.
it smells like a forest.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, as fragrant as that is, and sometimes I would say the scent can be a little bit off-putting. To
Yeah.
be completely honest,
Yeah. I
it
mean,
is
it has a
funky.
fermented like smell,
Hmm.
kind of, but not what you're thinking. Like kombucha fermented, it doesn't smell vinegary.
Hmm.
It's like you said, like mushroomy almost.
Yeah, so you do get a really good earthy quality, but surprisingly, if you're tasting this, it is super smooth.
Oh wow.
And just fairly mellow. It's not intensely bold flavored.
Okay.
It's really smooth and very warming and comforting. It really is incredibly good for digestion.
Okay.
So
Much
it's
like
very healthy tea.
fermented, like
Hmm.
kombucha. Anything fermented is pretty good for your digestive system. So this might be a fun new way to check
Yeah,
out
yeah.
helping your gut health.
Don't let the fragrance put you off. Try it first before you
Okay.
make a decision on it, because it is very interesting and very very unique.
Yeah. And I think that goes to like that's the same for any tea really. I mean, obviously you have your basic like herbal teas that are super fragrant and you're going to get a
Hmm.
really strong lavender note off of or things like that. But in terms of all the other teas, they all like, as a kid, I didn't go out of my way to drink unsweetened green tea and it's an acquired taste that I grew with over time. So I think with any of these teas, you're looking at giving something a chance, definitely give it a little bit of grace to like try it and really see how you enjoy it throughout your day-to-day routine. I know for me green and white tea is what I stick with typically. But I used to be strictly a black tea person. I only drank black tea growing up just because it's common. But I think over time your taste buds develop to like or dislike things more,
Hmm.
and so
Yeah.
you will acquire a taste for things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas for me, I definitely drink a lot of black tea more often than anything else. I drink that throughout the day. I also really do enjoy green teas. I enjoy white teas. It's got to be the right time of the day, right situation for it, where I'm feeling one tea over the other. And oolongs, those are definitely the teas that I'm going to go for when I really want to savor, really have a moment where I can enjoy every bit of the whole tea experience
Okay.
and really take in all of there's so much more complexity
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, to the craft in the
Oolong.
oolong teas,
Yeah.
that it really, if I am not able to be present
Enjoying
and
it.
focused
Yeah.
in that moment, then I don't brew those teas. But if I can really sit there and enjoy a tea, I've got a slow moment, and I'm able to be present, then I really do go for those oolongs.
Yeah.
I enjoy that tea experience
Yeah. Well, and
very
something
much.
we've touched on a little bit in our previous videos is the idea of like integrating tea into your routine. And I
Mhm.
think same with this. After learning some of this, I hope that you guys are able to take some of this knowledge and have more appreciation for the culture and history of tea. I know for me, like I didn't even know that oolong, what differed it was that it's just not oxidized as much as a black tea. I think learning this stuff kind of allows you to have more appreciation and therefore create more of a routine and therefore slow down a little bit. I think
Mhm.
right now we're in a time where people are go, go, go in this world, and it's nice to take a minute to slow down and enjoy a cup of tea every once in a while. So,
Yeah, and we have said this before, but I do want to reiterate a little bit with this. As you're experiencing tea, some of these teas, like for me, for the oolong, they do take a little bit more time and attention. But when you give that time, and you're present and you're focused, and you develop a tea time and a ritual within your day, or maybe once a week or once a month, it doesn't have to be every time. When you do that, it gives you back so much more, and so
mm-hmm.
you really do get a lot of value from being able to create that mental space where you're focused on something and you're enjoying and you're savoring every bit of what you are
Yeah.
experiencing there. Tea is always better enjoyed with people. So
Yes.
it's better together is what we like to say.
Yes. Well, we hope you guys really enjoyed watching this video. We sure love sharing our love of tea with you guys, and we can't wait to continue sharing our love of tea. These tea talks have become a really fun time for us to share our love and create a community of tea lovers just like us. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more like this, be sure to give us a follow, and we'll be back later with more content.
Yeah, and if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, there's all kinds of things that we would love to talk about, but we'd rather it be what you want to hear. So post it in the comments, reach out to us. We're a small team. We love to hear your feedback. We love to hear your questions. We love to hear people getting excited about tea just like us. So if you have any questions or anything you're curious about, we'd love to address it in some future tea talks.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day, everyone.